these companies that profit off complicated layering,
Mm,
um, they have an incentive to keep that game going. And that's why I, since the very beginning, was never interested in commercializing my work on
mm.
Rails because I knew that I could have all these noble ideals about how we should build software and we should keep it simple and we should compress complexity instead of layering it away. And I'd go like, all that would eventually disappear because the incentives of needing to sustain and grow a business would overwhelm that. And I would end up being a merchant of complexity. And I have no interest in being a merchant of complexity.
Today's guest is David Heinemeier Hansson. David's bio is frankly embarrassing. He's the creator of Rails, one of the most popular development frameworks of all the time, the co-founder and CTO at Basecamp, a New York Times bestseller author, and a professional racing driver for more than 10 years. In our chat, we explored many of David's strong opinions on software development, including excessive complexity in software and infrastructure, the role of AI, and the future of open source. We also talked about his racing and how he approaches learning any topic from scratch. So let's dive in after a short word from our sponsor. Chances are you know of engineering metrics programs that didn't get adopted or failed to deliver the promised productivity gains. But why? Because those metrics live in dashboards, and dashboards die on the vine. They were built for a purpose, then people just forget about them. Sleuth Pulse solves this by bringing metrics and people together and powering engineering reviews across your organization. Sprint reviews, monthly check-ins, and resource planning are all examples of common reviews in engineering teams that help you achieve alignment and successful execution. They are truly the best way to make metrics part of the workflow. So Sleuth uplevels them by bringing in quantitative and qualitative data, letting people add context, and using AI to summarize data and pick out outliers. Check out sleuth.io for more information. Hey, David, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
So, David, you really need no introduction thanks to your work on Rails, on Basecamp, and all your ideas that have driven so much of the conversation online about software engineering. So, this was at the same time, I think, maybe the easiest interview I had to prepare because I'm so familiar with your ideas, but also the hardest because I had to pick a few select topics to ask you. So I will start from something very recent because a few days ago you published a blog post called Merchants of Complexity, which I loved. And it goes against some of the unnecessary complexity and layering that exists today in tech, which I think is a common thread across your work. You have talked about this many times, from hosting your own servers, rolling your own auth, and many things. And it made me reflect on my own experience because a counter take might be that technology historically has thrived by adding layers that strip away complexity, makes us work at higher level of abstraction, not care about the details. So what is different here? Do you believe that today we have all this layering that is kind of overblown and should be undone in some cases?
I think the problem is that as you add more layers, the stack just gets taller and taller. And very often, to understand the entire thing and to build something real, you now need a broader team of more specialists. And that
Yeah.
really is the essence of what I'm trying to push back against. I am not interested in building additional layers that allow us to go further if it requires us to have a huge team and each member on that team has to be, I'm a front end framework specialist, engineer, whatever titles might exist inside a huge company in order to build something competitive. I want to work on tools and approaches that allow a single developer to build a competitive business, really, online. And the method I look at that through is the idea of compressing complexity, not
Mm,
packaging it, not adding more layers that hides it, but compressing it such that you're still in contact with the actual problem. It is just, it's less. And there's therefore room for more. A good example for me is Active Record, which is the
mhm.
object relational mapper we have in Rails. When you use Active Record, you're not divorced from SQL.
Yeah.
Active record is not even, it is an abstraction. It is an attempt to compress the complexity of a lot of SQL work, and not even necessarily complexity, but just labor of it. You still have to have an
Yeah.
understanding about how databases work once you get to a greater scale. We're not trying to hide away the fact fully that there's a SQL database underneath there. That was one of the very early kind of ideas or battle of ideas that we have
Yeah.
with object relational mappers. When I first started working on Rails, there were things in the Java world that tried very hard to erase this idea that you even knew it was SQL underneath, that you even had to
Yeah.
think about things like n+1 or joins or whatever, and that the entire query language was wrapped in sort of a different translation or different dialect of it.
Yeah.
So I'm not interested in that. I want to compress complexity, but retain it so you have a connection to it, just so you can fit more, and then enable a single developer to be completely competitive and capable of building an entire system that they can bootstrap a business around.
Yeah. So basically, what you're saying is that all this layering is not really removing complexity. It is replacing, let's say, the native complexity of the layers in on the lowest level with some different complexity that is specific to the new layer, which just adds more noise, more specialists, and make things more complicated. Is this what you're saying?
In essence, yes. And I think a great example, or there are a million great examples, but if we take one example that's perhaps easier to understand, for me, around system administration, a lot of developers have this feeling that managing a server is, oh, that's outside of their realm. They can't do that. Could someone just wrap that in Kubernetes, for example? Could they wrap that in another sort of entity that then I can try to understand it? But it still boils down to servers. And you very often end up in this situation, as I've encountered multiple times. You log into AWS and you go like, this is the simple way of running a service, right? And it's hideously complicated. That is so easy in your quest to try to completely erase a area of complexity, that the solution you come up with eventually become more complicated and becomes more sort of compartmentalized, more in need of specialists, because we're so desperately trying to do away with some of the intrinsic complexity. If you are a small team with a web developer working on a system, you should aspire to have a basic understanding of how Linux works, for example. You should have a
Yeah.
basic understanding of, oh, here's some ports and they're open and I can SSH into a machine and so forth. Because if you're not willing to understand that, you're going to be forced into understanding essentially the same thing wrapped in usually a commercial package that
Yeah.
then locks you in. Oh, you're an AWS specialist? Well, that's great, but no, not really. Like, what are you going to
Yeah.
do if you change to move somewhere else? What if you're going to get out of the cloud? If you understand the fundamentals, that has a tendency to be more timeless. And I think it's the same thing with the example with Active Record. Whatever time you've invested in actually understanding how SQL works and how queries are constructed and so on, that's evergreen knowledge that you could have learned that stuff back
Yeah.
in 95, and 30 years later, it's still paying dividends. And that's one of those areas where how to learn to become a developer overlaps very well with the ideas about how to run a good business. Jeff Bezos, who happens to own a small slice of my company, told Jason and I very early on when we were meeting with him that one of the ways he looked about where to invest was invest in the things that don't change. Like
Yeah.
for him with Amazon, it was the idea that people are not going to wake up tomorrow and wish that shipping was slower.
Yeah.
At the time, it was revolutionary that Amazon could deliver packages in 2 days at the cost they were doing. Now they're delivering it in like 12 hours. It's continued
Yes.
to invest in that. And when I look at developers, I see the same things. Where are you investing? If you invested in a good understanding of SQL, for example,
Yeah.
that's going to pay dividends, perhaps, probably until the end of time. If you
Yeah.
invested some of your time understanding Linux, how servers
Yeah.
work, how they're connected, and how you set them up, it's going to pay dividends until the end of time. Now, actually figuring out what is a durable technology and what's not a durable technology
It's
is not
tricky.
always that easy. But I
Yeah.
think there are clues and there are domains where you can see a general churn rate being very high. I think JavaScript with some merit, has earned this badge of churn, right? That there's
Yeah.
constantly new frameworks. They seem to barely last for 5 minutes, and then there's something else that comes out. Um, that does not seem like a stable ground where you're investing for the long term, that those things are going to pay off over the horizon. And that's probably one of the things I'm really proud about with Rails. So Rails is a web framework. There's a lot of churn in web frameworks. But if you learned
Yeah.
Rails, let's say even 15 years ago, and you
Yeah.
learned Active Record at that time, you can absolutely derive dividends from that still. The Active Record of today, there's more, it can do more things, but the fundamentals are very similar. In fact, you can go
Yeah.
all the way back to the beginning. If you go back to the original 2004 video blog I did for Rails, the 15 minutes how to create a blog video, and you compare what the shape of that code looks like to a modern Rails application, even to a very large Rails application, you could find a huge degree of overlap between
Yeah.
that shape and even something as big as Shopify. If you open up
Yeah.
a Shopify controller, you'd see something where, like, hey, there's a shape here that is comparable. So I'm trying to do that strategy, investing in things that don't change on both my own accounts, such that my own personal investments pay dividends, but also the work that I do and encourage others to adopt have that same quality to it. That we're not just constantly churning through concepts and throwing them out and starting from scratch the next day over. I think that's one of
Yeah.
the perhaps fairest critiques of programming as a profession, is this idea that there's no residuals. That you're
Yeah.
like every year, it's like you're starting with a barren land and you have
It's true.
to replant and redo everything. And that gets tiring and it gets hard to keep up and all the other things, right? How can we counteract that? How can we make sure that the soil retains some nutrients such that if we replant next year, we're getting the benefits of the fact that last year and the year before that and the decade before that, we were taking good care of the soil that's up here in our little brain pot.
Yeah, I love this angle, focusing on evergreen knowledge uh, and abstractions that do not. I mean, the good abstractions look to me the ones, based on what you said, that do not completely divorce yourself from the underlying concepts and this
Yes.
evergreen knowledge. And I think Active Record is a fantastic example. And so you're making the case for avoiding a lot of this layering. For example, you mentioned infrastructure, and you've said this many times. You can just, run your own VPS instead of going through all these middlemen. But do you think this has always been the case, or is it like that? Maybe it's 2024, and maybe tooling for doing these things yourself has caught up with what is available on commercial platforms. Because, for example, I've lived through the Heroku era, and as from my understanding, back then it was not easy to create a similar developer experience by yourself. But maybe 10 to 15 years later, we have all the tools, and we don't have to go through platform as a service tools or SaaS tools to do this.
I think that's spot on. And a parallel I like to think of this is with medical patents. So someone invests a lot of money coming up with a novel way of dealing with diabetics, for example.
Yeah,
And they're granted a patent then in the medical world, I think, I forget how long, is it 18 years, 17 years, something like that, that they have an exclusivity on that idea and they can profit from the fact that they invested in coming up with it. But then at some point, the medication goes off patent and it becomes a generic and the price plummets and it becomes a commodity suddenly. The compounds are just being put together by someone who have no idea how they could come up with compounds in the first place, but they know how to manufacture things. That's good for the world. It is good for the world on both ends of it. It is actually good for the world. And I know pharmaceutical companies justifiably get a lot of shit for expensive drugs and whatever. But what's the alternative? Would you like to not have new drugs? Would you like to not have new medical innovations? I think the patent regime and the shortness of that regime in the medical world is actually a good trade off. We will reward the companies that come up with new innovation with outsized spoils if they hit the jackpot on something. And
yeah,
then eventually we will turn it into generics and we will all benefit greatly from it. Heroku to me is exactly that. Heroku, when it came out, I think, 2010, 11,
yeah,
something like that, was so far ahead in ergonomics of how a developer would get their application online that they justifiably reaped some really serious benefits from that, and they reaped some very serious economics from that. But now, well enough time has passed that not only had the core building blocks we're dealing with when we talk about deployment, particularly containerization, that was really
Yeah.
the tipping point, right? When we went from a way of deploying where we're just sort of moving files onto a pet server that had to be meticulously configured by some system administrator who would sit down for 4 hours to set all the dependencies up. And then we moved over to a world where we're dealing with containers that are widely shared, that you just depend from a root image, you just add your little stuff on top of it, and no longer do you need to do all the little pet management, right? Once we moved into that, we had enabled the possibility that we could turn something like Heroku, the ergonomics of a Heroku experience, into a generic. And that's the work that I've been really passionate about in the last few years, ever since we decided that we're going to move out of the cloud with Basecamp and Hey and the other products we have at 37 Signals. I wanted a generic tool set, a tool set that was not tied to a commercial vendor, but had the ergonomics of that experience. I was not willing to say, like, okay, let's go back to the Stone Age. Let's go back to
Yeah.
pet servers where someone has to massage it for 4 hours
Yeah.
before it's ready to accept the deployment, right? Like, no, I want the economics of the Heroku setup. I want the one command. I want all of that, and we can have it. And I think the same thing, for example, has happened with sophisticated. I don't even know what is a good word because I kind of gag a little bit whenever I say that. Sophisticated. It sounds so pretentious. But another word that's been used, ambitious. I also hate that. Let's just call it modern, for lack of a better word. Modern web applications, is particularly on the front end. For quite a while, to get access to high fidelity, that's actually a word I like, to high fidelity user interfaces that feel really quick and fast and responsive and can be contrasted with the old 2005 way of the entire page reloads and refreshes, and you lose everything. If you wanted that style of application, for quite a while, you were forced to endure an unreasonable amount of complexity. An unreasonable amount of complexity from transpilers and bundlers and pipelines and up the wazoo. And when folks looked at that morass of complexity, they were very eager to think, can I just pay someone to avoid this? Can I
Yeah.
just pay a platform somewhere to figure it all out for me? And we lived through that era for a while where it was really complicated to do by yourself, and a bunch of platforms came up to solve that. Then the fundamentals underneath changed. Browsers caught up. Suddenly you could write modern JavaScript that could produce those kinds of high fidelity user interfaces using nothing more than old school JavaScript and text files that you shipped straight to a browser without manipulating that at all on your end first. And that was another example of, like, you know what, you had the patent lockup period where
Yeah.
real progress, that's not discounted, it is real progress, is locked up inside of these sort of premiums, complexity premiums that you had to pay. All
Mm-mm-mm-mm-mm-mm.
right, I want a modern app. I don't really like how to work with it, but I have to do it. We went through that with Rails. I integrated Webpack with Rails in, what was that, Rails 5.2 or 6 or something. And I knew going in, oh man, this is so expensive in terms of conceptual overhead, in terms of complexity, but I want the thing. I'm not willing to go back. I want the feeling of these modern user interfaces. And if Rails is going to stay in touch with new applications that want to be developed, we have to do this. So
Yeah.
I sort of held my nose a little bit, begrudgingly accepted the complexity. And then the second I realized that the patent framing or the patent time was up, that this was off patent, that now I could get the same outcomes without the corresponding complexity, I was like, yes, sign me up. Let's get out of bundlers. Let's go to hashtag no build. Let's do all of these things so that we can get rid of all this complexity, so that we can compress the complexity. We're still in contact with what it is and how it works. And when I work on JavaScript, for example, I still have to know what a browser is and how the DOM works. I can't abstract all that away. I don't want to abstract all of that away. But it is so much less energy and space in my head to take up, right?
Yeah.
No wonder in that past era, from let's say 2010 to 15, we ended up splitting the industry. Suddenly there were front end developers, and those front
Yeah.
end developers were a completely different category and beast than the backend developers. That I don't think that was a healthy thing. I think that was one of the most terrible rifts we've created in the web development world. That we were so much better off when people were full stack. And I mean, full
Yeah.
stack has, I mean, using hashtags here because or quotes because full stack sounds old. It sounds outdated. It sounds like something you did 20 years ago, maybe, or 15
Yeah.
years ago. And I'm like, no, 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 that's not how we're going to look at it. We're going to look at it in terms of the amount of productivity that a single individual can wield. And if
Yeah.
we're regressing on that, which we were for quite a while, that's what the whole split is about. It is about saying a single individual is no longer capable of producing the outcomes we're after. So we have to get front end developers and they have to be separate from back end developers because no single developer can keep it all in their head. That's an admission that the complexity is so expensive
Yes.
that we cannot imagine that single individuals are able to pay it. No, no, that's a failure state. I mean, we should look at that and go like, okay, maybe just like with Webpack and some of this other complexity, we're going to hold our nose for a little while because we want the outcomes and we don't know how else to get it. But we should absolutely be working on solving that problem, rejoining things back again, and making things straightforward enough that single individuals and programmers can both do front end and back end, and we don't need this rift through the
Yeah.
industry.
But how do you think that we got there in the first place? Is that because, I mean, something that I think sometimes is that there is so much work and frameworks and open source work that comes out of big tech that maybe is more suited for large organizations than, the rest of us, small teams. But is that enough to explain that complexity kind of exploded even for small projects? Or are there like other incentives or stuff? What do you think?
I think that is a key component. A lot of open source, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, have become extracted from large companies.
Yeah.
And the dynamics and the pricing is just so different. Like a Facebook doesn't care if they need 10 different specialists and composing a team from that. That doesn't matter. A small startup absolutely doesn't matter. When we started Basecamp back in 2003, I was the sole technical person. That was why I ended up with Ruby. That was why I ended up building Rails, because I needed to build tools that made that single developer, me, so
Yeah.
productive and so capable that we could do it all. Because it was never in the cards that we were going to hire a team of 10 people to build the first version of Basecamp. The alternative, if that had been the reality, was it was just not going to happen. And this was something I talked about in my Rails World keynote from last year. I think this trend that a lot of open source was being extracted from large companies merged with another trend was the ZIRP, the zero interest rate phenomenon, or whatever that stands for.
Yeah.
Where for a while, a lot of startups were being funded in very lavish ways
Yeah.
to the point where it didn't really matter whether the tools were productive or not. It didn't really matter whether it took a team of 2 or 10 or 20 to build the first prototype, because the money was free and it was flowing readily. Now, that phase has ended. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're starting to have this conversation now, why we're starting to see more of an interest in reining back that complexity, because it's simply unaffordable. Like
Yeah.
we simply do not have the available capital. Lots of companies don't have the available capital to squander it in these ways. And you have that. And then you also have the third dynamic, which is something I talked about in the Merchants of Complexity. Complexity sells really well.
Yeah.
And this is one of the sad realities, even of open source software. A lot of open source software, as soon as it gets tied to the hip to a commercial company that's trying to advance it, and plenty of examples of that, there's no longer an incentive to keep it simple. In fact, there's a very high incentives to continue to complicate it. Because if it's not complicated, why do you need their consulting services? Why do you need their upsells? Why do you need all this other stuff? Simple software doesn't require all the around stuff. It doesn't require the consultants. It doesn't require as much training. It doesn't require all these other traditional avenues of how you build an open source business. Now, is that a sort of conspiracy? Someone's like, oh, let's make a lot of complicated software so we can sell all these. No, it's not. But incentives drive behavior.
Yeah.
Often they drive behavior in ways the people who are being driven would not agree to. It's the same what is the Upton Sinclair quote? It's hard for a man to understand that which his paycheck relies on him not understanding. That's what an
Yeah,
incentive is, right? Like
love this quote.
these companies that profit off complicated layering,
Mm,
um, they have an incentive to keep that game going. And that's why I, since the very beginning, was never interested in commercializing my work on
mm,
Rails because I knew that I could have all these noble ideals about how we should build software and we should keep it simple and we should compress complexity instead of layering it away. And I'd go like, all that would eventually disappear because the incentives of needing to sustain and grow a business would overwhelm that. And I would end up being a merchant of complexity. And I have no interest in being a merchant of complexity. So to avoid that, I have to firewall the two parts of the business. I make my money selling end user applications, and then I enjoy myself making tools for developers without a commercial interest in whether they use it or not or how they use it or not, which means that I don't have to chase the same things as the merchant of complexity has to change. We can stay more true to a coherent model of how we build software, even if it isn't as generally appealing, it isn't as responsive to the market, as you could say. This is one of the reasons, for example, it created such a drama when we dropped TypeScript from one of our front end packages last year because people had this idea the market is asking for type safety. The market is asking for more TypeScript. Why are you not delivering what the market is asking for? I'm like, I don't give a shit what the market is asking for. I want to build software the way I want to build software. I want to keep it simple. I don't like static typing. I don't like explicit typing. I actually like JavaScript. I think it's a wonderful language. It's my second favorite language, distant second, but second favorite language after Ruby. And I don't want to soil that with TypeScript. Now, I can say all that and still accept that other people are finding value in TypeScript, that they enjoy it. Wonderful, great. Don't make me do it too, right? And
yeah,
those kinds of, or that ability to make decisions that no one would give you permission to do is what I love, right? Like if we had Rails Inc. and we had a board, and that board was looking at charts about the growing popularity of TypeScript, they'd all be like, we should get some TypeScript in there. Can you get TypeScript into the next version in one way
yeah,
or another? I don't want those incentives. I don't
yeah.
want those
Do you
pressures.
think is that unavoidable? I mean, I can think all the drama after the, and probably you have seen this. There's been the interview to Peter Levels at Lex Friedman, and he talked explicitly about open source frameworks backed by companies that advance them and provide hosting, maybe, and that creates, murky incentives for everybody. And do you think that because in a way the provider is incentivized to create some kind of complexity or lock-in
Yes,
element. And do
yes.
you think this is unavoidable? That is the moment you try to make open source commercially viable that way by making it backed by a company, it leads to eventually over complexity, lock-in tendencies because of going after profit.
The short answer, yes. I think that's exactly what the incentives point towards. I think some companies are more successful than others in starving that off.
Yeah,
Some companies are incorporated by individuals who feel more strongly about keeping things simple and they are able to
yeah,
resist the pull of these incentives better than others. But ultimately, the incentives will shape the overall industry in the direction that this is going. And I think this is why we're still able to be so contrarian, really, with the Rails work and the world that I'm doing, is that those incentives are just not pulling on me at all. So to exist outside of that gravitational pull, you get to float freely in the world. And that looks disconcerting, I think, to a lot of people that why are you not following the trends? Why are you not following this general direction? Um, but that's the gift. That's the gift of being outside of that gravitational pull, being away from those incentives. And I think I used the parallel before about the medical industry. I think it's actually very similar to that. In the medical industry, there's a very high incentive to creating treatments, not cures. It is far more profitable to come up with a treatment that you have to take year after year to deal with a certain condition than it is to come up with a cure. A cure you can sell to someone once, and you might make a profit on that one sale, but a a treatment plan that needs to be taken year after year, like that's a subscription. This is how the whole
Yeah.
world has pivoted in software, right? Like we all want subscription, we all want recurring revenue, we all want MRR and ARR and all these other things. We don't want to just sell a product anymore. That's not nearly as profitable as turning people into a continuous spigot of money into the coffers, right? And I'm guilty of that too, to some degree in my commercial work, right? Like we sell Basecamp on a subscription. So this is why I can recognize that, right? I can see how, oh wow, that is a really strong force that just pulls you closer into it. But it's also why I'm trying to fight back against it, even in the commercial world. So once.com is idea that was born directly out of that, trying to escape those incentives. Could we return software to being a product instead of a service? And that's in the commercial realm, but that's always how I thought about it in the open source world. I don't want a service. I don't want to be on the hook for supplying you something where I have to worry about uptime. No, no. I'm selling you a toolkit, and I'm not even selling it to you. I'm freaking giving it to you, right? This is a gift. Now, these are your tools. Here's a hammer, here's a saw, here's a screwdriver. You could build amazing things with that. You could build the freaking Taj Mahal if you put enough effort into it with this tool set, but it's a gift. And now you're on your own. I'm not liable if you don't know how to wield a saw and one of your fingers is cut off. The saw needs to be sharp. Otherwise, it's not very good at cutting down trees. It'll cut off a finger too. Great. That's part of the package. That's the deal, which is the way I've been framing open source and my involvement into it. I look at it as a gift economy. And actually,
Mm,
even that's actually a misnomer. It's not an economy. It's a gift exchange. I show
mm.
up to the gift exchange and I go, "Hello, everyone. Here's a bunch of tools that I made that I needed for myself. You can have them for free if you don't hold me liable. Do you have any tools you might share? Could we trade?" And that's how Rails came to be what it is, that we have whatever, almost 7,000 people over the years who've contributed their tools in the gift exchange. And we've
Yeah.
gone back and forth. And the total net sum of all that gift sharing is an incredibly vibrant commons that is the opposite of the tragedy of the commons, right? Like it's the
Yeah.
spoils, it's the splendor of the commons. That's what open source is when it works well.
Love this. Love this take. And I love the work you're doing with once.com. You said something before saying that uh, chasing MRR and subscriptions, everybody's doing that because it is more profitable. I'm actually not 100% sure it is more profitable. I think it's more predictable and that makes people more comfortable. But sometimes I think that one-time purchases can be just as profitable, if not more profitable. I think they're trickier to handle as a business, probably, but I wouldn't count on them being less profitable.
I think that's a wonderful point. And I'm thinking of another parallel here, which is the movie business. Right. For movies have gotten more and more expensive to make. And as they've gotten more and more expensive, you need other people's money. And other people's money often comes with those strings of, do you know what? I want a predictable return here. I don't want one day to get zero back and the next day I get 100x back. Humans are very risk adverse. And generally, they will trend towards the safer bet, right? So, this is how we end up with
Yeah.
a trillion sequels, that everything has to be a franchise. Everything has to be
Yes.
a Marvel this number 27, because that's a tried and true formula where we can get things too. And that sort of works right up until it doesn't, right? A lot of the sort of upheaval in the movie industry lately has been some of those recipes haven't been working as well as they used to work. And I think that's the same thing in the subscription software world. We went quite a long time where everyone just accepted the fact, yeah, of course, all software should be sold on a subscription. And then eventually the consumer, whether that consumer is an individual or business, wakes up to the fact, hey, wait a minute, I'm paying for 475 different subscriptions. Yeah, each individually might not be that expensive. You add it all up and it's absolutely atrociously expensive. This has to change. And that was one of the reasons why I was interested in the once.com idea, because it feels like a zick when everyone else is
Yeah.
sacking. And we were sacking for the longest time, right? Like Basecamp, literally 20 years old. We rode that SaaS wave well before it was even called SaaS, back when you still had to convince people that it was safe to put in a credit card online, right? And then you realized, you know what? Once everyone has switched over to a certain model, that's when there's new open
Yeah.
terrain for an alternative. And that's how a lot of things work in software, both on the commercial side and another. The pendulum swings, right? And I think we're
Yeah.
well overdue a pendulum swing away from everything being a subscription.
Yeah, yeah, love this. And so we spoke a lot about complexity, where software is going, and so I have to ask you about AI because like a couple of days ago I watched a video. I think it was an 8 years old girl coding completely by putting herself into the hands of AI, and she made like a Harry Potter chatbot, I think, with React connecting to OpenAI. So you have a history of having strong ideas about where software development should go. And so I want to take advantage of this to figure out where AI may take us. So first of all, do you use AI for coding even?
I use it as a non-driving pair programmer, and I love it
Okay.
for that. Absolutely love it. I started several months ago, and I always have um, an LLM up and running that I'll ask questions in much the same way as I'm imagining if I was sitting in pair programming. I'd ask my pair programmer, "Hey, do you know how to use this API? Do you know how to do this?" And I love it for that. But what I've also found is it is a very fine line before it is actively eroding your own muscles. It's sort of like jumping into an exoskeleton and you go like, "Oh man, I have superhuman power." But the more you use that exoskeleton and not your own muscles, the more those muscles atrophy. That is what muscles do, right? You either use them or lose them. And I found this when I was working on Amacoup. Amacoup is my remix, let's call it that, of Ubuntu because
Hmm.
I had switched to Linux. I wanted a beautiful, productive programming environment, and I found that the default installation of Ubuntu left me wanting. I had to learn so many different things to figure out, oh, I need this package, that package to put it all together. So I thought, hey, do you know what? I could build this. I could build a way to turn Ubuntu from this generic thing that has to appeal to everything from a school to a government office, whatever, into something that's uniquely tuned to look great for a developer, me, my
Yeah.
own. Um, so I start working on that, right? And I start working on it in Bash because I'm like, you know what? I could use Ruby for this. We could use Ruby, but this feels like a Bash job, and I just find that interesting. Let me just. It's about setting things up. It's about installing things and so forth. Bash is actually it gets a lot of crap as a programming language. Not unjustifiably so. Would I ever write a web app in Bash? No, no, I would not. But as a configuration tool for setting up a new machine, I think it's actually the right tool for the job. And it was very effective in kind of pushing boundaries. As soon as I was trying to do something complicated that required a little more programming, I'd go like, yeah, Bash really doesn't want me to do this, does it? It does not. Let
Yeah.
me find a simpler way of doing this that I can do just with a few conditionals and so forth. But either way, I hadn't worked with a lot of Bash before. So what I would
Mhm.
do a lot is I would ask the LLM, hey, how do I write this? And maybe I'd write some Ruby and I'd ask it to translate it into Bash for me. And what I found was it was working very well. Holy
Mm.
smokes. What would have taken me so much longer on Stack Overflow or Google or whatever
Yeah.
to look up syntax or idioms, I was just getting the answer right away. What
Yeah.
I also found was it was taking much longer for those answers to sink in muscle memory. Like I would keep
Mm.
looking up the same things. And that to me was one of those oh shit moments. Like, am I
Mm.
actually learning anything here? Am I smarter at the end of this LLM session than I
Yeah.
was when I began? Or am I actually a little dumber? And
Mm.
I don't have the full answer here. Like, I didn't stop using LLMs. I still
Yeah.
find them to be very compelling. And one of the reasons they're very compelling, ironically, is that Google's gone to shit, right? Like, I remember when Google was the way we would learn how to program because it was
Yeah.
um,
Not
such a
anymore,
powerful
probably.
way to find things around the web. And the web was a different place. It wasn't plastered in cookie banners and banners of all kinds and whatever. There was just more direct information. Now LLMs are essentially giving us the good Google, the one where you ask
Yeah.
it a question and you get the hopefully correct answer.
Yeah.
So I'm not against AI in any way, shape, or form. I think it's amazing, absolutely amazing that an 8-year-old girl can sit down and make a whole program. Um, it's very unclear to me what the future of
Yeah.
AI actually is and what I even want it to be. That's the other thing. Um, I actually like programming, and I like programming not just to get solutions. I like that too, but I like programming in the same way that I don't actually play an instrument, but several people in my family play an instrument. My wife plays an instrument. My kids play instruments. They love the playing. My wife likes to sit down on the piano and play a song that we could just have put on Spotify, right?
Yeah.
We could just put that on Spotify. You don't have to work. You don't have to work for it at all. And we get to hear the music. No, no, no. I want to play the piano. I want to be the one who puts in the tune. That's how I feel about programming. I like
Yeah.
playing the piano of a computer. So what if I could get like a Spotify version of that? So what if I could ask AI to do something of that? Is that actually what I want? Now, of course, at some point there's an intersection between what I want and what's commercially viable and how the world changes. I mean, you could have gone in whatever the 1920s, go like, I really like horses. I love delivering milk by horses.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Do you know what? That's just not an option anymore. You're not going to be able to
We have
deliver
to
milk by
talk.
horses.
Yeah.
Um, but horses are still around, right? Horses are still
Yes.
around. They are now a bit of a luxury piece of entertainment, and maybe that is what programming is going to turn into. Essentially, horseback riding. That a bunch of
Yeah.
privileged people who just enjoy that can sit around and still program. But also, I think it's possible that we are in the peak of the hype cycle, in much the
Hmm.
same way that, say, self-driving cars were in
Mm, 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 mm.
2017. 2017, Musk goes out and makes the proclamation. By the end of the year, I mean, you'll be able to make money off your Model S because they'll be driving strangers around. It'll actually be an investment. Um, and a bunch of other car manufacturers went like, we will not even put steering wheels in these cars anymore because yeah, that didn't happen. Like it's closer
Mm.
now to happening. Waymo in San Francisco and so on is impressing a lot of
Yes.
people. FSD 12.5 is
But it
impressing a
took a
lot.
lot of time. Yeah.
We're getting closer, but when are we there? Right? You can think further back. I remember when I saw The Lawnmower Man, this classic virtual reality movie from 1995. And I watched that and I go like, holy shit, in like 2 years, I'm going to be living inside virtual reality. I'm going to be an avatar just floating in space, right? Yeah, that didn't happen, did it? We have VR today. It's better than it's ever been. I love playing, what is the Beat Saber,
Beat
the
Saber. Yeah.
game? Like, great,
Love that too.
wonderful. Did it rewrite society? Ah,
Not
no, it
really.
didn't. Remember the Segway? Segway came out, well, actually, you have to be kind of old to remember Segway. I think it came out in like 2001 or something. They're like, we're going to rewrite cities. Like, we're all going to be nerding around in these two-wheelers, and that's what's going to be. And then even further back, in the 1950s, I think it was, Van Neumann and the rest of all the pioneers of computer science went like, yeah, within the next decade, we're going to have general AI. Okay. It's hard to make predictions about the future. In fact, it is almost impossible. And the best thing we can do is that we can look at the future that's already here, but just not widely distributed. Um,
Hmm.
that's that famous quote. And you can look at something
Yeah.
that already does exist now and go like, are we going to have more of that in that way? Probably. But what's very difficult is to imagine the thing that does not exist yet, like an AI that can write all our code, like an AI that I can just say, like, hey, can you manage Basecamp for me now? Just listen to some customers, here's some feature requests, and you turn out pull requests, and you can just merge them yourself, right? Like that, the general AI ideal. Are we going to get there? Now, of course, there's plenty of stations in between where we are now and that general AI that can do the whole business for us, and that can be helpful, but we don't know where it is. And these things have a tendency to be very uneven, where we get a vast, massive acceleration in its capacity. And then we extrapolate, oh, we're this early in the curve. If you just take that curve and go 5 years forward, we're going to have general AI. Not a wonderful example of this is jet propulsion, planes. So we went from what Wright brothers, is that like 1907? We go from the famous article in the New York Times saying like it's going to be 10,000 years before humans fly, and like 6 months later they're literally flying, right? And then whatever 10 years after that we're using planes in warfare. Another, what's that going to be, 30, 40 years after that we come up with the jet fighter. A
And
little bit
then
after
went to
that
the
we come
moon
up
after like a couple of
in,
10 years. Yeah.
we come up with intercontinental flight, and it's totally natural if you're in 1950s and they've just come up with the precursor to the 737. You're like, holy shit, like in 20 years we're going to be flying from Japan to Copenhagen in like an hour. And then it just stopped. It just stopped, right? We reached a ceiling where we're still dealing. I think the 737 that's based on like an iterative version of the original hall from like the 50s. Like we just reached a ceiling where we couldn't really improve it. I mean, we've improved it. Fuel economy has gotten a little better. The windows have gotten like 30% bigger in the Dreamliner than they were in the 1950s. Pretty modest, right? Pretty modest. Now, are we at the cusp of essentially a 1950s or 60s ceiling in the evolution of the of intercontinental jets with AI? I don't know. And
Yeah.
isn't that exciting? Isn't that exciting? That's what I find so appealing about the whole AI debate is like we are at this moment where we can imagine both ways. We can imagine that general AI is literally like maybe 3 years away, maybe
Yeah.
5 years away, maybe the entire society is going to be rewritten in 5 years. That's amazing to think about, right? Or we're VR in 1995. We're
Yes.
jet flight in 1964. We are AI in 1958.
That's true.
Don't know. That's
Yeah.
exciting. We don't know what the next season of reality is going to bring us. Great.
Yeah.
I'd hate to
Yeah. I
know it
agree.
all.
I agree, and I think that impossible to predict the future, and it's not that useful to think about that long term when things are so are moving so fast. So I think the most useful approach, even for engineers, is just to approach these things from a place of curiosity. And
Yes.
I mean, sometimes I hear this FOMO, I feel that, and I think because I love programming, just like you said, and sometimes I worry that will turn into some kind of liability even because I will resist, using more
Yes.
tools. So I will,
Yes.
so I force myself even to try things. And by the way, I loved your use case with Bash because I think one of the things that are enabled the most by the current generation of AI tools is becoming like getting this basic proficiency at
Yes.
across the whole languages and that let you really use the right tool for the job. And if you look at the past 10 to 15 years, a lot of things have flattened out to the same languages, the same frameworks because it was so convenient to port your skills, to Electron to create native apps and stuff like that. And so I'm really happy to see that the barrier to entry to many things that were niche and are niche has kind of lowered a lot because you can use AI for that.
Yes.
As opposed to, I'm already super proficient with Rails and Ruby, and AI makes me go to the next level. I don't really believe in that, but I believe a lot in the use cases that you have said.
And that's the one I've experienced. I think my conclusion from that experience was just you gotta at some point try to take off the training wheels. Like
Yeah.
use AI to level up and get the quicker answer, but at some point also try to like, can I even ride without this? Or has this now become a learned helplessness where I don't know how to keep my own balance? I need those training wheels. What, forever? That is a level of dependency that I'm not sort of that at ease with. But I also fully agree with you. You're not going to get anything out of standing back there and yelling like alluded. We should not use AI. We should pause AI for 6 months. What are you talking about? Like
Yeah.
progress just marches forward, and you have to adapt to that. There's been no invention in human history that materially improved productivity of humans that we were able to say like, yeah, actually, let's just not do that. Someone's going to do it. And in most cases, the advancement in productivity is a net gain for the globe as a whole. We can use our spare capacity then in new, novel ways, and that is what lifts us all up. And this is how we get a growing economy and all these other things. Growing, not even growing economy, that sounds so abstract. Growing prosperity, right? That we can
Yeah.
get more, we can have access to more, and that's a good thing, generally speaking.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So we have a few minutes left, but I really wanted to ask you this and segue into totally different topic because not everybody knows that you're also a very accomplished racing driver. So you have raced Le Mans 11 times, right? And so this is up to the highest professional level. And something and I don't do racing in real life. I do a lot of sim racing. So this is a very selfish question. Maybe people in the newsletter don't give a shit about this, but I wanted to ask. So how do you approach learning something up to the highest level in a space that is completely different from your core job in, I guess, very limited time on your hands? probably. And you've been doing so even for such a long time.
What's funny is that the methodology by which I learn things is the same regardless of which domain I'm in. So
I hoped for this answer.
I had not realized that when I learned programming. But after I had learned programming to a certain level of proficiency, I was able to look back and think of like what were some of the techniques I was using to learn programming faster and become proficient quicker. And then I used those same techniques sort of explicitly around photography. I wanted
Yeah.
to be able to take decent, good, great pictures, if for nothing else, to record my memories of me, my family, and whatever. And I just went like, all right, what was it that worked in programming? Well, one thing is developing an eye to get an appreciation
Mhm.
for something good. Why is it good? Right? In
Yeah.
photography, it's teaching you the ability to distinguish white balance, for example. Is it off? Does it have a yellow tint? Does it have a magenta tint? There's something there. The composition, the rule of thirds, those kind of
Yeah.
things. Oh, there's a way to notice that. Sort of the color correction. How do you make an image more interesting? And some of that you develop by looking at photos. I would look at a good photo and I would try to recreate it in my own scene. And then I would learn like what's hard. Oh, that's the thing I have to tweak and so forth. So you identify the good things. You don't fully know yet why something is good, but then you try to just copy it. Don't try
Yeah.
to like, oh, let me come up with something super creative. No, no. Let me just learn the basics first. And I learned the basics by following other people and simply trying to replicate what they're doing.
Yeah.
Exactly the same thing in racing. Right from the minute I started racing, I would try to seek out professional racers who were obviously much faster than I was. I could then compare the data overlay. This is one of the ways where it gets very close to programming, actually. You
Yeah.
get sort of this diagnostic of a lap where you see, like, oh, this person is on the throttle here. They let off the brake in this way. And then you realize this is what I got to do. And then you also realize it's not that easy. Just knowing something is not the same thing as doing something. I can know I'm supposed to brake at Le Mans at 120 meters before the first chicane. I'm supposed to bleed off the brake in just this way. I start with whatever 40 bar and I got to get to 80 bar by the apex. And then I got to let off a little bit because there's a bump in the middle of the road. I can see the bump
Yeah.
on the data
On the
because we have
telemetry.
damper
Yeah.
traces. So you see the spike in the damper trace. And then I have to get back on it again because I need the front loading of the car. I need the mass of the car to be over the front wheels to give me the turn in so that I can make the next corner, right? There's so much in that is first identifying what actually matters. What's more important? Is it the braking phase? Is it the letting off phase? Is it getting out of the corner? There's some knowledge there. And then once you have the knowledge, trying to replicate that, and then building up your skill set in that way. So I found that race car driving was actually very similar to how to learn how to do photography. It was very similar to learn how to do programming. And a lot of it came from the beginner's mind. That's a concept
Yeah.
in learning where you go like, first of all, I'm going to have full humility here. I am not good. No one, let me put it that way. No one is good at driving a race car fast the first time they sit in a race car.
Yeah.
That's just, might have more talent, which means that you may be able to pick this up faster than other people. But before you've been in there and before you learn, you're going to suck, right? So embrace
Yeah.
the suck. Embrace the fact that you're incompetent in the most literal sense of that word. You do not have competence to do this thing. Therefore, you should be maximally open to people who have more competence than you to teach you things. And this is where I see, especially with race car driving, but in all domains really, that people they peter out quick because they reach like a modest level of basic competence and then they think they're amazing. And I always thought, like, you know what, that seems so stupid to me, especially in race car driving, where the stopwatch will tell you whether you're amazing or not,
Yeah.
right? If you're off from pole,
Very
you're not
objective.
amazing.
Yeah.
So that led me to think, you know what? First of all, I'm not amazing. I don't know shit. I should be a sponge. I should accept the fact that I'm not good at this. And then I should learn from the people who are good at this. And then I should treat my comparison pool, at least that was my instinct, as the whole world, right? I'm not interested in being the fastest racer at my local track. Like,
Yeah.
that doesn't do anything for me. Quite early in my racing career, I was like, I want to race at Le Mans. The people who race at Le Mans are pretty good. Actually, they're not pretty good. They're the best in the world when it comes to sports car driving, right? So to compete at that level, that's what I should be measuring myself against. Like being the fastest person at my local track does nothing to accomplish that goal. So it keeps me in the beginner's mind much longer. Like I was
Yeah.
actually quite, to pat myself on the back, I was quite quick by the time I sort of started competing against the best in the world by the local standards that I could have compared myself against. But I sucked, and I still suck to a large degree compared to literally the very best in the world. So some of it is about like how do you pick your scale? Who do you identify as the ones in your industry or domain that you want to learn from, and how can you just clone what it is that they're doing with no ego?
Yeah, love this. I mean, I'm taking away develop good taste for what is good, embrace the suck, beginner's mind, and be very methodical. Copy, improve. Don't measure yourself against your local competition, but visualize maybe where you want to be, and you
Yes.
visualize that you wanted to race at Le Mans.
Yes.
Yeah, love this. And use technology. Do you do sim racing, for example? Are you, there is this increasing trend. The sim racing is helping a lot of people. People are transitioning into real life racing, and Verstappen, big believer of that. Many people. We are technologists, so I am excited that technology democratizes fields like racing, for example, which is historically very expensive. So, what do you think about that? Is this something you do or you look into?
Yeah, I love sim racing for that sense. I mean, racing is ludicrously and prohibitively expensive for almost everyone in
Yeah.
the world if you want to race at a place like Le Mans. So the idea that we could all have access to it through increasingly compelling simulations is amazing to me. I think my problem is that the simulation is not yet good enough. I
Yeah.
totally believe in the general concept, and I have sims. I use sims to prepare, but I'm also keenly aware of the distance between the physical feedback you get in a sim
Mhm.
versus physical feedback you get in a car. And a large part of the satisfaction I derive from driving race cars, particularly the kind of cars I drive, which is these LMP
Yeah, MP2
prototypes
and
that
yeah.
that pull upwards of 4Gs. Like that physical sensation is half of my enjoyment.
Yeah.
So when I sit in a sim, that doesn't exist, right? You don't get the physical
Yeah.
feedback you get the physical feedback from the steering wheel, and that's one of those areas where I've seen the development of sim technology really advance. I think I got my first sim maybe 10 years ago, and the steering wheel was sort of okay, fine. And then I got a new sim maybe a year and a half ago, and I was like, holy shit, the steering wheel feels exactly like it does in a real car. The
Wow.
feedback I get through the wheel has now reached 97% fidelity to
Yeah.
reality.
Wow.
That's incredible. If I could get the other things to that level, I'd be thrilled to leave reality racing behind and just go full on sim racing. But we're not quite there yet, and that uncanny valley for me has been
Yeah.
difficult to cope with. And in fact, I would say for the kind of racing that I do, I found that too much sim racing is actually detrimental because
Yeah.
I start internalizing and programming my brain to the simulation of reality that exists in the sim, where you can do sometimes some very strange things that physics will not allow you to do. And then you get on a real track, and now you're bound by the physics of the universe, not the
Yeah.
physics of the game engine. And you can get some nasty surprises. And I know that there's some sim racers and professional racers who are very good at distinguishing between those things and can jump back and forth. What I've come to accept is that the way I get really fast at race car driving is I program uh, something in my brain and then I run that program over and over again. I'm very good at sticking to a
Mm.
program. I'm not
Mm.
so good at changing programs. So I
Yeah.
can't just be fast in one category, jump to another category, or be fast in the sim and then jump to the real racing. Because like I have to unload the old program and then load the new program, right? I wish it was like the Matrix where he just gets the plug in there and like, I know Kung
Yes.
Fu. That is unfortunately not how it works for me. I wish it did. But yeah, I really like the prospect of sim racing. I can't wait until it gets better and until somehow they find a way to simulate the G forces.
Yeah. Yeah. Would love that too. We'll get there eventually. Maybe, I don't know where we are, if either, in the inflated expectations, like AI, maybe we'll get deflated a little bit, or, we'll keep progressing, but eventually we'll get there. So, David, thank you so much again for this chat. I loved it. And thank you again for coming on the show.
My pleasure. This was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.